Maybe grief has affected your judgment, Margaret, my daughter-in-law said, her voice smooth as polished glass, and the room waited for me to break. They had chosen the evening carefully. 40 years to the day since Thomas and I first walked into that little church on Maple Street, hands trembling, believing love was enough to build a lifetime. Now the house he left behind stood quiet and immaculate, the white columns freshly washed, the lawn trimmed to exactly 2 inches, the American flag by the porch swaying in the late spring air. Lindsay insisted we mark the anniversary with a small gathering. Just immediate family, she said. Daniel handled the wine, a $60 bottle he mentioned twice before dinner was served. I set the table myself with the good china, the ivory set Thomas brought back from Boston on our 25th anniversary. 8 place settings. Linen napkins pressed flat, silver polished until it reflected the chandelier above. I noticed how Lindsay rearranged the seating at the last minute, placing me at the far end instead of the head of the table. It flows better for conversation, she explained with a tight smile. I nodded. The roast chicken was carved. Glasses were filled. The conversation drifted from property taxes to the rising cost of homeowners insurance. Then Lindsay stood, tapping her fork lightly against her glass. To Margaret, she said, lifting her wine, for teaching us how not to overstay our welcome. A few nervous laughs fluttered across the table. Daniel didn't laugh. He stared into his plate. I felt every eye turn toward me, waiting for outrage, for tears, for something loud and embarrassing that could later be labeled unstable. I folded my napkin once. Then again, I placed it beside my plate and took a sip of water. Thank you, Lindsay, I said. My voice didn't shake. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. They had been trying for months. Subtle suggestions about senior living communities 20 miles outside town. Brochures left on the kitchen counter. A comment about how stairs can be dangerous after 70. The locksmith invoice I found in Daniel's desk drawer last week, dated but not yet used. I had watched, listened, waited. Earlier that afternoon, I stood in Thomas's study, sunlight cutting across the hardwood floors in sharp lines. His leather chair still faced the window, as if he might return at any moment with his morning coffee. Never let them see you bleed, he used to say whenever business partners tried to corner him into a rushed decision. I understood that lesson now more than ever. When dessert was served, Lindsay leaned toward me, her perfume sweet and deliberate. We just worry about you being alone in such a large house, she said softly, though loud enough for others to hear. Alone. The word was bait. I smiled again. I've never felt alone here, I replied. And I meant it. The walls held 40 years of memory. They also held paperwork filed carefully in a safe deposit box downtown. Documents signed 4 months ago under the calm guidance of an attorney who had known Thomas since 1982. They thought tonight would be the night I snapped. They thought silence meant surrender. Instead, I gave them nothing. And in that nothing, something far more powerful was already taking shape. The guests left just after 9:30, their cars backing out of the driveway one by one, red tail lights fading against the quiet street, and I stood at the front window with my hands lightly folded in front of me, watching until the last vehicle turned the corner. The house settled into silence the way it always did after company, with a soft hum from the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the hallway clock that Thomas insisted on winding himself every Sunday evening. Daniel lingered near the dining room, stacking plates too carefully, as if he expected them to shatter. Lindsay moved through the kitchen with efficient precision, rinsing glasses that did not need rinsing, opening and closing cabinets that were already closed. They did not look at me. Not directly. I carried the serving platter to the sink and ran warm water over the remaining sauce, letting it spiral down the drain. The anniversary dinner had been their stage. The laughter had been measured. The comment had not been accidental. It had been rehearsed. I could see that now with perfect clarity. 6 months ago, shortly after Thomas passed, the suggestions began to arrive in gentle packaging. A brochure from a senior living community placed neatly beside my morning newspaper. A conversation about how the property taxes in our county had increased by almost 8%. A remark about how difficult it must be to maintain a 4-bedroom house. Alone. I listened each time without answering more than necessary. I learned that silence makes people speak more. Daniel cleared his throat. He asked if I had thought any further about downsizing. He said it as though he were asking about the weather forecast. I dried my hands slowly with a linen towel before turning toward him. I told him I was comfortable where I was, that the stairs did not trouble me, that my annual physical had come back perfectly normal. Lindsay leaned against the counter, arms folded, her expression sympathetic in a way that did not reach her eyes. She mentioned that memory can change after loss, that grief sometimes clouds practical judgment. The sentence hovered between us like a challenge. I noticed Daniel did not correct her. I noticed he did not agree either. He simply waited. I walked past them into the hallway and paused by the framed photograph of Thomas in his Navy suit, taken the year he retired. His smile was steady, confident, certain of his place in the world. I had stood beside that man for 4 decades. I had watched him negotiate contracts worth more than this house. I had watched him walk away from deals that did not honor his terms. I understood now that what they were attempting was not about concern. It was about control. They needed me to react. They needed something emotional and impulsive that could be labeled unstable. Instead, I picked up the stack of anniversary cards from the side table and carried them upstairs to my bedroom. The safe deposit key rested in the top drawer of my nightstand, exactly where I left it. I touched it briefly, not to reassure myself, but to remind myself that preparation is quieter than panic. Downstairs, I could hear Lindsay whispering. I could not make out the words, only the tone. Impatient. Calculating. They believed tonight had shifted something in their favor. They were wrong. Nothing had shifted except my certainty that timing, not anger, would decide what happened next. The next morning began the way most mornings in this house had begun for the last 40 years, with sunlight slipping through the kitchen curtains and settling across the oak table where Thomas used to read the financial section of the newspaper. I rose at 6:30, as I always did, and brewed coffee strong enough to fill the room with its steady warmth. Routine is a powerful thing. It reminds other people that you are stable, that you are present, that you are not unraveling in quiet corners. Daniel came downstairs around 7, dressed earlier than usual for a man who worked remotely 3 days a week. He greeted me with a careful smile and asked how I had slept. I told him I had slept well. It was the truth. I do not lose sleep over strategy. Lindsay followed 10 minutes later, her heels tapping against the hardwood floors, her expression bright in a way that suggested she had already decided how the day would unfold. She mentioned that she had scheduled a consultation for me with a financial advisor, someone she described as excellent with estate transitions and long-term planning. She said it lightly, as though she were suggesting a new restaurant. I stirred my coffee once before answering. I told her that I had met with my own advisor earlier this year and that my affairs were in order. The words caused a pause. A small one, but measurable. Daniel asked when I had done that. I said it was in January, before the winter storms, when the roads were still clear. I did not elaborate. There is power in withholding details. Lindsay pressed further, asking whether I had considered the tax implications of keeping a property this size. She referenced heating costs and maintenance expenses, mentioning exact figures as though she had rehearsed them. I listened without interrupting. I noticed how Daniel watched my face, searching for confusion, for hesitation, for any sign that I did not understand the numbers being presented. Instead, I asked a question of my own. I asked whether either of them had reviewed the current deed to the house. The room shifted slightly at that. Daniel said of course he knew the house was in my name. I nodded. Then I reminded him that ownership is not the same as access. The sentence landed gently but firmly. Lindsay set her mug down with more force than necessary. She asked what I meant. I told her that Thomas and I believed in planning ahead, that we believed in making decisions before emotions had the chance to interfere. I stood, rinsed my cup, and placed it in the dishwasher. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past at exactly 25 miles per hour, the speed limit clearly posted at the corner. Everything in this neighborhood moved according to rules. Paperwork followed rules as well. Deadlines, signatures, notarizations. Daniel cleared his throat again and said they only wanted what was best for me. I met his eyes and held them. I told him I appreciated their concern. And then I reminded him, calmly, that concern and control are not the same thing. Neither of them answered after that. They had expected denial or defensiveness. What they received instead was information. And information, when delivered without emotion, is far more unsettling than anger. By the end of that week, the temperature had climbed to 72 degrees, warm enough for me to open the windows and let fresh air move through the house. carrying away the faint scent of last Sunday's roast and replacing it with the clean trace of newly cut grass from the neighbor's yard. I moved slowly but deliberately from room to room, not because I was tired, but because deliberate movement unsettles people who are waiting for haste. Lindsay had become quieter in my presence, which told me she was recalculating. Silence from her was never surrender. It was preparation. On Thursday afternoon, I found a folder placed neatly on the kitchen counter. It contained printed listings for condominiums approximately 15 miles south of here, each one described as low maintenance, secure, ideal for seniors seeking community. There were handwritten notes in the margins about resale value and projected appreciation rates over 5 years. I read every page before setting it back exactly where it had been left. When Daniel came home that evening, he stood beside the counter longer than necessary, as though waiting for a reaction that had not yet arrived. He finally asked whether I had looked at the properties. I told him I had. He asked what I thought. I replied that they were well staged in the photographs, but staging does not change ownership. He frowned slightly at that, confused by a response that did not follow the emotional script he had expected. Later that night, as I passed the study, I heard Lindsay's voice drifting through the half-closed door. She was speaking softly but urgently. She said that if I would not agree willingly, they might need documentation of diminished judgment. The words were careful, almost clinical, but the meaning was clear. They were not simply suggesting change. They were building a narrative. I did not pause outside the door. I did not confront them. I continued down the hallway and entered my bedroom, where the late evening light fell across the dresser Thomas built himself the summer we turned 50. I sat on the edge of the bed and considered the timeline. They believed pressure would create cracks. They believed repetition would produce surrender. What they did not understand was that months before that first brochure appeared on my table, I had already anticipated this shift. Grief does not erase instinct. It sharpens it. The following morning, I drove downtown at 10:15, parked in the same metered space I have used for years, and walked 2 blocks to the bank. The air carried the faint smell of coffee from the corner cafe, and the sidewalks were busy with professionals on early lunch breaks. Routine again. Stability again. Inside the bank, I signed a confirmation form acknowledging receipt of updated trust documentation. The manager recognized my name and offered condolences, which I accepted with quiet gratitude. Paperwork is patient. It waits for the right moment to speak. When I returned home just after noon, Lindsay was seated at the kitchen table with her laptop open, spreadsheets reflected in her glasses. She looked up and asked where I had been. I told her I had taken care of something important. She asked if it was something they should know about. I smiled politely and said that when the time came, everyone would know exactly what they needed to know. Then I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the head of my own table, and allowed the silence to do what anger never could. Sunday arrived with a quiet tension that settled over the house like humidity before a summer storm, invisible but unmistakable, and I sensed that whatever patience they had been practicing was nearing its limit. After church, which I attended alone as I had done for months now, I returned to find Daniel and Lindsay seated in the living room with papers spread neatly across the coffee table. They both looked up at the sound of my keys resting in the porcelain bowl by the door. Daniel stood first and said they hoped I had a few minutes to talk. His tone was measured, almost rehearsed, and Lindsay's posture was composed in a way that suggested agreement had already been reached without me present. I removed my gloves, placed my purse on the side chair, and took the armchair across from them, the same chair Thomas favored during football season. The documents on the table were arranged carefully: a property valuation estimate, projected annual maintenance costs, and what appeared to be a preliminary transfer form. Lindsay explained that they had spoken with an attorney who specialized in family transitions and asset protection. She emphasized that this was simply to make things easier for everyone in the future. I listened without interrupting, allowing each sentence to settle before the next one began. Daniel added that transferring the house into joint ownership now would avoid complications later. He said it would ensure stability. The word stability lingered between us, shaped to imply that I was the unstable element in the equation. I leaned forward slightly and asked whether this attorney had reviewed my existing estate plan. Daniel hesitated, then admitted that they had assumed I did not have one finalized. Lindsay interjected quickly, suggesting that given my recent loss, it would be understandable if certain details had been overlooked. The suggestion was gentle, but the implication was not. They were building a case, piece by piece, framing urgency as responsibility. I folded my hands loosely in my lap and told them I appreciated their initiative. I told them that planning is wise. Then I asked why the transfer form was already partially completed if this was only a discussion. Silence followed, brief but revealing. Daniel glanced at Lindsay before answering that it was simply efficient to prepare in advance. I nodded once, acknowledging the logic without accepting the premise. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the block, its steady hum cutting through the quiet room. Normal life continued beyond these walls, unaware of the negotiation unfolding inside. I rose from my chair and walked to the bookshelf, running my fingers lightly across the spines of volumes Thomas collected over the years. Without turning around, I said that ownership is not something I enter into casually. I reminded them that this house was not only square footage and market value. It was a contract signed long ago between two people who believed in foresight. When I faced them again, I could see impatience tightening Lindsay's expression. Daniel asked more firmly now whether I trusted them. I answered carefully. I said that trust is demonstrated through transparency, not pressure. Then I excused myself, leaving the papers exactly where they lay, untouched and unsigned, and allowed them to sit with the only thing I had given them that afternoon, uncertainty. The following week unfolded with a precision that would have impressed Thomas. Small changes began appearing throughout the house, subtle adjustments that might have gone unnoticed by someone less attentive. The framed photograph in the hallway shifted 2 inches to the left. The antique lamp in the study was moved to a side table near the staircase. Even the thermostat setting, which I kept at a steady 70 degrees, was lowered without discussion. Each alteration carried the same message. This space was becoming negotiable. On Wednesday afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find the locksmith's truck parked discreetly along the curb. The same company name printed on the invoice I had discovered weeks earlier was displayed in bold blue letters across the side. I paused at the end of the driveway, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and observed without rushing forward. Daniel stood near the front door speaking quietly with the technician. Lindsay remained inside, visible through the window, her posture rigid with expectation. When Daniel saw my car, he dismissed the technician quickly, offering a handshake and what looked like a forced smile. The truck pulled away before I even stepped out of the vehicle. Daniel met me halfway up the walkway and explained that he had only been asking about upgraded security options. He said it was for my protection. I told him I appreciated his initiative and walked past him into the house. Inside, I noticed that the front door handle had not been replaced. Nothing visible had changed. That was important. They were still testing limits, not crossing them. That evening, Lindsay brought up the idea of scheduling a cognitive assessment, framing it as routine for individuals over 70. She referenced an article she claimed to have read, suggesting early evaluation prevents complications later. Her tone was professional, almost detached, as if she were discussing weather patterns instead of my mental clarity. I listened until she finished, and then asked whether she had scheduled one for herself. She laughed lightly, assuming I was joking. I did not smile. I told her that my physician of 20 years had not expressed any concerns during my last physical, which included memory screening. I reminded her that medical decisions remain personal unless proven otherwise by law. Daniel shifted in his seat, uncomfortable now with the direction of the conversation. The air in the room felt thinner, not because of conflict, but because expectation was collapsing. They had anticipated resistance that could be framed as instability. Instead, they encountered documentation, calm answers, and an absence of emotional fracture. Later that night, as I stood by the bedroom window, I could hear them arguing in hushed tones down the hall. Not loudly, not recklessly, but urgently. I did not need to hear every word to understand the pattern. Pressure had not produced panic. Suggestion had not produced surrender. The strategy would need to change, and I suspected they were already planning the next move. I closed the curtains carefully, turned off the bedside lamp, and allowed the house to settle into darkness, knowing that preparation is quiet work and that silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness but control. 2 days later, Daniel announced that he had scheduled a family meeting for Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and the formality in his voice told me this was no longer a conversation but a presentation. He said an attorney would be joining us by video call to clarify certain options regarding property structure and future planning. Lindsay stood beside him while he spoke, her expression composed, her confidence restored by the presence of professional validation. I agreed without hesitation. Saturday arrived clear and bright, the sky an uninterrupted blue stretching over the neighborhood, as though nothing beneath it carried tension. At 2:45, I set out a tray with water glasses and placed it on the dining table. I wore the navy dress I reserve for serious appointments, the one with clean lines and no decoration. Appearance matters when others are preparing to question your competence. Daniel connected the laptop to the television screen at exactly 3 o'clock. The attorney appeared, well-groomed and efficient, greeting each of us by name. He began outlining the benefits of consolidating ownership, explaining tax efficiencies and streamlined inheritance. His tone was neutral, practiced, and clearly briefed in advance. I listened carefully, noting which phrases were emphasized and which were rushed. When he finished, he asked whether I had any questions. I did. I asked whether he had reviewed the trust documentation filed in January under my name. There was a pause, brief but unmistakable. He admitted that he had not been provided with such documentation. Lindsay interjected quickly, saying she was unaware of any finalized trust. I reached for the folder I had placed discreetly beneath my chair before the meeting began. I slid it onto the table and opened it without drama. Inside were certified copies, notarized and dated 4 months prior. I explained that the house had already been transferred into an irrevocable trust under my direction, with terms that preserved my lifetime residency and defined distribution conditions clearly. Daniel stared at the papers as though they were written in another language. The attorney adjusted his glasses and asked to see the clause outlining beneficiary conduct. I turned to the marked page and read it aloud, my voice steady. Any attempt to coerce, manipulate, or question the mental competence of the grantor without medical evidence would result in immediate exclusion from any future benefit tied to the property. Silence filled the room in a way that felt almost physical. Lindsay's composure faltered for the first time. She asked when I had done this. I answered truthfully. In January. Before the brochures. Before the consultations. Before the locksmith's visit. Daniel leaned back in his chair, realization settling slowly across his face. The attorney cleared his throat and confirmed that the structure was legally sound. There was nothing further to recommend. I closed the folder gently and folded my hands on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply allowed the documentation to speak where emotion never had. For months they had been preparing a narrative about my instability. What they encountered instead was foresight. And foresight, once revealed, cannot be undone. The meeting ended without raised voices, which somehow made the outcome heavier. The attorney signed off with a polite nod, reminding us that proper planning often prevents unnecessary conflict. And then the television screen returned to its dark reflection of our own faces. Daniel remained seated for several seconds after the call disconnected, his hands resting flat against the dining table as though steadying himself. Lindsay stood first, gathering her printed documents with controlled movements, aligning the edges carefully even though the argument she had prepared no longer applied. I closed the trust folder and returned it to my side of the table without hurry. No one spoke immediately. Outside, a delivery van paused at the curb across the street, a driver stepping out to carry a package to a neighbor's porch, life continuing in its ordinary rhythm. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and asked why I had not told them sooner. His tone was not angry. It was wounded, layered with embarrassment. I answered honestly. I said that foresight does not require permission. I reminded him that his father and I had built our lives on preparation, not reaction. Lindsay responded more quickly, suggesting that transparency within a family should come before legal maneuvering. I met her gaze and asked whether transparency had guided the brochures, the locksmith consultation, or the cognitive assessment suggestion. The question settled quietly between us. Daniel shifted in his chair, understanding now that each attempt to position me as vulnerable had already been anticipated. I stood and carried the water glasses back to the kitchen, rinsing them one by one beneath steady running water. The simple act grounded the moment. When I returned to the dining room, Daniel remained alone at the table. Lindsay had retreated upstairs, her footsteps firm against the hardwood floors. Daniel looked older than he had that morning. He asked whether the clause about coercion was truly necessary. I told him it was not written out of anger. It was written out of clarity. I explained that when people begin to question competence without cause, they introduce doubt into places that require trust. The clause was not punishment. It was protection. He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. I could see the realization forming that every suggestion they had made had been documented in memory long before it reached paper. There is a difference between being alone and being unprepared. I had never been either. That evening, the house felt different, not hostile but recalibrated. Lindsay avoided direct conversation, speaking instead through brief updates about dinner plans and grocery needs. Daniel remained quiet, thoughtful in a way that suggested he was reevaluating more than just property rights. I moved through the rooms with the same steady pace I had always maintained, adjusting nothing, claiming nothing overtly. Ownership does not require announcement. It requires understanding. And now, finally, understanding had arrived, not through confrontation, but through consequence delivered without a single raised voice. The days that followed were quieter than any argument could have been. Silence settled into the corners of the house, not tense anymore, but measured. Lindsay no longer left brochures on the counter. The topic of assessments and transfers disappeared from casual conversation. Daniel began spending more time in the garage, organizing tools that had already been organized, avoiding the dining room where the meeting had shifted everything. I did not change my routine. I rose at 6:30, brewed coffee, watered the hydrangeas along the front walkway, and walked 1 mile around the neighborhood each evening just before sunset. Stability is not something you declare. It is something you demonstrate consistently. One afternoon, about a week after the meeting, Daniel knocked lightly on the study door while I was reviewing old paperwork. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, not with secrecy, but with intention. He told me he had not realized how far things had gone. He admitted that the pressure had started as practical concern and slowly turned into something else. I listened without interrupting. Accountability sounds different from defense. He asked whether the clause in the trust could ever be amended. I answered truthfully. Yes, it could, under the right conditions. Conditions built on respect, not urgency. He nodded, absorbing the weight of that distinction. Later that evening, Lindsay joined us at dinner with a restraint I had not seen before. Her tone was careful, her words chosen with more thought. She asked about my garden plans for the fall, about whether I intended to repaint the guest room. Simple questions. Ordinary questions. Perhaps she was recalculating again. Perhaps she was learning. I did not rush to interpret the shift. Change, like trust, requires time measured in months, not minutes. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the lights dimmed, I walked through the hallway and paused beneath the framed photograph of Thomas. The house was quiet, steady, unchanged in its structure even if its dynamics had been reset. I considered how easily anger could have rewritten this story. One outburst, one emotional fracture, and the narrative they were constructing might have taken hold. Instead, documentation had spoken where emotion might have failed. Preparation had answered pressure. I turned off the hallway light and stood for a moment in the soft darkness. There is a particular strength in withholding reaction, in allowing others to reveal their intentions fully before responding. It is not weakness. It is discipline. The house remained mine not because I fought for it loudly, but because I secured it quietly. And in that quiet, I found something more enduring than victory. I found clarity about who I am, about what foresight truly means, and about the difference between being tested and being defeated. They had tried to move me without force, to guide me toward surrender without confrontation. Instead, they learned that calm is not emptiness. It is resolve held steady. And sometimes, giving nothing is the most decisive answer of all.